Recording has now started. I didn't share that much about the interface yet, so it should be all right. Okay, so this is the Blender kit. So download the Blender kit add-on right away for some ease of use later. We'll get into that. Right, it's not that important. The second one, go back to your Blender preferences, and for the people who are watching this back, you have your Blender interface. You go to the top left where you have Edit, go to Preferences, and then you have right in the middle, there's an option called Add-ons, which are the Blender plugins. Right, so there, search for Node Wrangler and enable that. Yes, Node Wrangler, Mr. Baked. And then you enable this, and you don't have to do anything with it right now. It is something we will use when we get to the material section of the tutorials. And whenever you change something in your Blender preferences, you will have to press this menu icon on the bottom left, which says Save and Load. Left click it and save your preferences. And what this does is basically make it load those preferences on the next time you start a Blender. Okay, next up, we're going to go to Input. This is something where you may want to change some settings depending on whether or not you're using, for example, a digital drawing tablet. So for example, an Intuos one, then you may want to enable the Emulate 3 button mouse. I have it enabled by default because it doesn't really change anything if you're using a mouse, but it does make it easier if you're going to use one of those digital tablets. And it basically allows you to still have a right mouse click when you are using one of those drawing tablets, so it makes your life a little bit easier. So I'm just going to enable that, leave it enabled, and you'll be fine. In the navigation section, there are a few things that I changed, and I changed this a long time ago. So if something doesn't look the same for you, then you can change it to the way it looks right here. One thing that I would disable, I'm not sure if this is enabled by default, but that is orbit around selection. If you enable this, it means that in your 3D viewport, you can pretty much rotate around your selected object, which pretty much limits the freedom of moving through your 3D space, in my opinion. So that's why I turned this off. And then you have a zoom to mouse position, which is something I really enjoy, and I'll touch on that later. So you can enable this. And in the key map section is where all of Blender's shortcuts will be listed, and there are way too many to remember. I don't remember all of them. The ones that we're going to use, I will explain. So don't worry about learning all of those. You can always search for a shortcut. For example, if you're curious what the shortcut is for scaling an object, you can just search for scale, and then you will have a huge list of shortcuts, because for each tool scaling can vary. So you can just look through the list and find the one that you are looking for. Okay, so the key maps, I have not changed a single shortcut in Blender because the default shortcuts are just fine. But if you use a laptop, and I think there will be some people that are using a laptop, then the chances are there that you don't have a numpad. So there are a few things that you should change at that point. Well, basically one thing, which is, let's see, we're going to type in camera. And then a little bit down the bottom, you will have the frame camera. No, wait, the view camera. So the view camera button basically means that you will be moved to the frame that your scene will be rendering. So when you press, for me, it is numpad 0. If I press that, I will see the entire scene through the camera. And that is what you will see in the render as well, right? So if you don't have a numpad, then I usually, when I work on a laptop, I change this to the 0 key on your keyboard. I don't think the 0 key is used for anything else that's important. So I recommend changing that to 0. All right, so if you have that set, you can just save your preferences once again. So go to the little menu icon, save your preferences. There we go, and you can close this entire window. All right, so now that we got that set up, we can actually start getting into the interface of Blender. And we are going to start at what you can see right here in the viewport, right? So this is the scene that is there when you start the Blender. And you can see there are 3, well, let's say 4 things that you may have to worry about that you're going to use. The first thing is the default cube. I think most people have already heard me say that before. The name default-Q is actually a derivative of the word default cube. So default cube, default-Q. I don't know. Seemed fun to me. So this is what Blender starts up with every single time. You will always have the default cube. Okay, then you will have this other small point. So you can just select an object by left clicking. And I'm actually going to enable my screencast keys right there so you can see the buttons that I'm pressing now. So this right here, this little point, it's a light. So it's just a simple light point, which basically means that if you go to render out this scene, you will at least see something, right? So there's at least some light in your scene. So that's what it starts off with. The third thing is your camera. So this little icon right there, it is the camera. And it will always be displayed like this. And the setting that we just changed makes you able to go into the camera. So for the people who didn't change any of the settings, it will be numpad 0. So numpad 0 moves into the camera view. By default, it is aimed towards that origin of your scene, towards the cube. For the people who did change it, you will have to press 0. And to go out of it, you can simply press the key once again. And now we're going to get a little bit into how do you move through your scene? How does the navigation work? Right, so you can zoom in and out by using your scroll wheel. So just scroll, and we just enabled zoom into mouse position, which basically means that you zoom to where your mouse is, right? Zoom in, zoom out, key of a mouse. You can always hold Control, I think, and then hold middle mouse button, and then move around, which allows you to zoom in and zoom out as well.
Sorry, that middle mouse button, that's Control, is it?
Control, middle mouse. But you can also just scroll with your middle mouse button, wheel to zoom in and out. Does that work for you?
Oh, you mean, when you say middle mouse button, you mean like push the wheel in then? Sorry.
Yeah, you can push the wheel in and hold Control. Yeah, sorry, that's what I mean.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I was like, why? We have 2 buttons.
All right, to move around, you can hold Shift and then hold down middle mouse button, so press it. And then you can move around through your scene, just like that. By rotating is what you do with holding only the middle mouse button and then just dragging your mouse around the screen. So you can rotate around your object. And that's basically it, right? So rotate, middle mouse button, zoom in, zoom out, scroll. And then you can move around by holding Shift and holding your middle mouse button. So the entire moving around in your interface is pretty much done with the middle mouse button primarily, which in my opinion is quite nice. All right, now that we've got that set up, there's this one last thing that you see in the middle right there. It's this circle of red and white. And that's quite unique for Blender. It is called the 3D cursor. And the 3D cursor is basically what your entire 3D scene is built around. It is basically what allows you to add new objects, and your new objects will always be added on the place where your 3D cursor is. And you can move this 3D cursor by, for example, clicking on the 3D cursor icon on the top left. So right under the selection tool, there is a cursor button. If you left click that, it will select it. And now you can basically place it wherever you want in the scene. All right. So now you may think, well, what if I move my 3D cursor away from the origin, but I want it back to the origin? It's going to be very difficult to actually get it completely back to the origin. Right, there's a shortcut for that, a hotkey. And it is Shift S, and that will open up this menu, right? And hold down Shift S, otherwise your menu will disappear. So hold it down, and then we get all these options for your cursor. So you can, for example, select cursor to world origin. There we go. So just hold Shift S, drag your mouse to the option that you want, and then you can let go of Shift S, and that will pretty much do that action. And now your cursor will be back. So now you know how to move your 3D cursor, right? And we're going to use that later a little bit more when we're actually going to start modeling and when we're going to add new objects. The other things that you see is a green line and a red line. And those basically represent the axis in Blender. And the axis basically mean that we are in a 3D space. So we have an x-axis where you can move your object, a y-axis where you can move your object to, and a z-axis. The vertical one is the z-axis and is usually hidden in Blender because it is pretty much always the same. It doesn't really change within programs. We all know that the z-axis is up, so we always have those hidden by default. And this basically shows you what direction you can move your objects in. And let's actually get into that a little bit more, right? So how do you move objects? And I'm going to assume that you all didn't delete that default cube just yet, that you still have it in your scene. If you select your default cube, and we have to go back to our actual selection tool, because right now we're still in our cursor, you can just left click on that select box, so the top left icon, or you can press W. And if you press W, you will go back to your selection, so the select box. But if you press it now again, that you have it selected, it will change the type of selection tool that you have. So it can range from a few different kinds. Left click on that selection tool and hold. It will show you the different options that you have. I usually use the select box because it allows you to just click objects, but it also allows you to draw a box around several objects and select multiple at once. Lasso select I never really use unless I need a very specific part of a mesh, for example. The circle select can be useful as well. I never really use that. So I usually keep it on the select box, right? And you can just cycle through those by pressing W a few times and you will see it change on the top left. All right, so now that we have that select tool enabled, we can just select our cube, left mouse click, and you will see that it gets highlighted in orange. So everything that is orange is actually selected in Blender. Now, how do we move this cube? Well, there's a very simple shortcut, the shortcut that you're probably going to use the most, and it is G. So press G, there we go, and now you can just drag your mouse around in your scene. And you can just move it to wherever you want. If you press left click, it will move to that position, and it will be there. All right, now sometimes you may want to move your object only in the X direction or the Y direction, right? And this is a very easy hotkey as well. Press G, so you go into your actual grab. So G stands for grab. Go into your grab mode where you can move your object, and then you can press X on your keyboard, for example. So press X, and it will lock your movement to one axis, so to the X axis. You can also press Y. So then it will lock it to the Y axis, and if you press Z, it will lock to the Z axis. All right, now there's also something that you can do, which is hold middle mouse button. So I'm going to do that right now, and it will show you all of the axes. So if you press a middle mouse button, you will see all of the axes that are there. And now you can drag your mouse to the axis that you want to move it to. So for example, the Z axis, move your mouse to the blue line, and you will drag it along in the Z axis. And the same thing for the X and the Y. All right, so that is pretty much how you move your object. So remember, G will be for moving around stuff in Blender. And it will not only be for objects, it will also be when we get to animating and to keyframes, to nodes, so to the texturing. G is always for moving. All right, next up, scaling. I think you can all already see where this is going. Scaling is done with S. So press S, drag your mouse, you scale your object up and down depending on where you move your mouse. Now you can lock this scaling the same way that you can lock the movement to a specific axis, which is by pressing, for example, X, scaling in the X direction, Y, and Z. But now comes the fun thing. Scaling can also be done in, for example, 2 axes, while excluding the 3rd axis. So for example, if you only want to scale this in the X and Y direction, but not in the Z direction. So the opposite of what we're doing right now. That is done by pressing Shift Z. Right, so now it scales in every direction except the axis that you press. So Shift Z means everything except the Z axis. Shift X means everything except the X. And Shift Y will scale it in every axis except the y-axis. And that's something very useful, something that I use a lot as well. So that is how you scale. Perfect. Left click to apply. Now, how to rotate. Rotating key is R. So R, and you can rotate it. And it will rotate by default, depending on where your 3D viewport is. So it will rotate around the origin, and the origin point is this little orange point, which is the center of your object in this case. So it will rotate around that center point, depending on where your current view is. So if I rotate my screen, middle mouse button, and then go to a different angle, and then press R, it will rotate according to that new angle of your viewport, right? So depending on where you are in your viewport, it will scale your object around your origin, just like that. All right, now of course you can always lock this in a specific axis the same way as we have been doing. So if you press R and Z, it will lock it to the Z-axis only. Now obviously we already rotated this cube a little bit funny, so it's not going to look that nicely as a rotation right now, but you can see it rotates around only the Z-axis, and we can do the same for X. So it will rotate around the X, and the Y as well. It will rotate around the Y. So just press those X numbers. So X, Y, Z. All right. Let's see. That is the rotation in place. We can apply movements. So that is something that is very important in Blender. So there is a little row of things right there on the right. So a row of, mine is way bigger than yours, I think, and that's because I have additional plugins. But there is going to be a little row of text and buttons right there. If it isn't there, it will be a small arrow button that you can press, that it will pretty much move out to the left. And if you can't find it, please tell me. But it will say item. It's the top thing, and it will show all of your item properties. So the transformation. So right now the location, the rotation, you can see that we rotated it quite a lot. And those numbers are basically what you rotated it with. Now you can change all of the rotations right here as well. So you can, for example, left click on the rotation and just type in 0. And it will change the X rotation to 0. And now if you do the Y direction, rotation to 0, and the Z, it will be completely as new. So it will be completely clean in rotation again. You can do the same thing for location. Set this to 0, for example. And for the scale, well, we don't want to set the scale to 0 because then our object will be gone. It will disappear because it has no scale, no size. So set this to 1, 1, and you can press tab to move to the new, to the next input. So 1, tab, 1, enter. Right, there we go. So now it is completely clean. You can also see the dimensions of your cube. You can change the X dimension. For example, you can type it in. You can set it to 3, for example. That would increase the size of your cube in the X direction to 3 meters. You can also drag this dimension. So for example, you can drag all of the input values in Blender, or at least most of them that you can change. You can left click and hold. So if you see this little double arrow icon appear, that means you're into the right track. Left click, hold, and then drag it to the left or to the right to change that input. All right. Now, since sometimes this may be a little bit much, right? So sometimes you may want to move it in smaller steps, in smaller increments. And that is easy to do in Blender by holding Shift. So if I move this right now, it moves quite fast and quite in big steps. But if I hold Shift and do the same movement, it goes way smoother. So you can get way more precise and detailed. And that is something you can use for pretty much everything in Blender. So for the rotation, I can also do the same. So left click and hold, or for example, the Z axis, it rotates it. If I hold Shift, it's going to rotate slower and more precise. So it will decrease those steps, so the step size. So remember that holding Shift while moving or rotating or changing inputs and dimensions, Shift will decrease the step size. So it will make your movements more precise. All right, now let's get a little bit more into what all of those icons mean. Right now, there's one thing selected on the top of your Blender interface, and it is the layout. At least that is what it is for me. You may also be in the modeling tab. They basically look the same, but the thing that changes when you go to layout is that you will get this additional bar in the bottom, which is used to animate. So if you press space, you will see this is going to move, the timeline is going to play. You can see all of those numbers changing, and those are the frames. So in the start, we are on frame 1. If we press space, the scene is pretty much going to play and move to a new keyframe until you press space again. That stops the timeline from moving, so the animation from playing. Right? It's not something you need right now, but once we get into animation, we're going to use this more and more. Right, so I am always working in the layout section simply because this timeline doesn't really bother me. It is only a small space, but if you have a smaller screen and it annoys you, you can move to the modeling tab and it will pretty much be the entire same interface, right? It is completely the same, except that for the layout, you will have this section right here. And if you want to have it right there, but you don't want it to take that much space, you can decrease the size, and let me show you how to do that. So if you move your mouse right to where those two windows, where they come together, right? So this little black line, you will see this double arrow icon up here. Left click, and you can drag it up to have it larger, or you can drag it down to have it smaller. So for now, we can just move that out of the way completely because we don't really want to use it for now until we get to the animation part. Okay. So we are in the layout section. I do everything in the layout section, let's see, except for compositing. You don't have to know what it is right now. So you have different options here: layout, modeling, sculpting. For example, if you go to the sculpting tab, so left click it, the interface will change. And that is because you will enter the sculpt mode. And the sculpt mode basically allows you to make organic shapes and pretty much just shape a 3D model as you want. We're not going to get into that right now. We're just going to do the layout real quick. And you have some more options right here that we're all going to get into later. For now, let's stay to our safe zone, which is going to be the layout. All right, so you will see some more buttons. So we've got the object mode. The object mode is, well, basically the scene setting, right? So right now we are in object mode, which means that you can select your object, you can move your object, so with G, and you can select all of the objects that are in the scene. So you can select the camera, the little lights, you can select all the objects that are there. And those objects, so if you want to see what objects are in your scene, you can watch the top right of your screen, which is, let me see what it's called again. It should be something like the outliner. This is the outliner. So it shows you all of the objects that are in your scene. So we've got the camera, the cube, and the light right there. So those all match with what you see in your viewport. So those are all the objects. Okay, now you can always select your cube. And now if you think, well, how are we going to change the shape of this cube? Well, you can move from object mode, so left click on it, and you can move to the second one, which is edit mode. Left click it, and then your interface will change a little bit. And don't worry about that at all for now. I just want to highlight how that option can change your interface. So edit mode, object mode. Switch between the two of those is a simple press of tab. So tab will change from edit mode to object mode. So if you're ever accidentally in edit mode, so if you can see your interface changing like this, if you can see all of the separate little parts of your mesh and you think, well, what's going on now? Simply press tab and you will move back to your original object mode. Okay, next up, we got some more buttons. Well, view doesn't really do that much. Really, it doesn't. I never use this button, so don't worry about it. You can change some of the view settings, obviously, of your scene. Basically what you can also do while you are moving through your scene. So I don't really use this. Select. It is an important one, but we're going to get into that. No worries at all. Now we've got the add button, which basically allows you to add all sorts of things to your scene. All right. So for example, you can join me on this. We want to add a new object. So go to add and go to mesh. So mesh is basically any kind of 3D shape. So if you go to the mesh, well, it can also be 2D. So we've got the plane, but it adds new geometry to your scene. And now we're just going to add this little monkey because it is Blender's default object. It is called Suzanne. So Suzanne is Blender's default object, the monkey, and just left click on that. There we go. Now we've got a new object in your scene, and you can just move around a little bit by using those 3D viewport buttons that I've already explained. And you will see that you now have this monkey. For me, it is in my cube. If you want to delete an object, you left click to select your cube, and then you press delete on the keyboard, and that will delete your cube. Now, if you by mistake delete something, just press Ctrl Z. There we go, and it will bring back your previous step. So it is the basic button. So Ctrl Z, and I think it's Ctrl Shift Z. Yes, so Ctrl Z to undo, Ctrl Shift Z to redo. Okay. So now we've got this monkey. So that is how you add and remove objects. You can get to the same input, so add, by holding a shortcut. So we've got another hotkey, Shift A. So Shift A allows you to add a new object, and it's the same section, the same thing that we just did, without actually having to click that button. So Shift A is just a shortcut to add a new object to your scene. Okay, so let's leave that alone for now, and let's get a little bit more into some other things in the interface that are important. Right, the things on the left you can basically forget for now. So we've got that select box, which I already explained, and we've got that cursor. And you will see that your monkey was just added on where your 3D cursor was at that point. Okay, now the things below that are basically the move button, the rotate, the scale, transform. Well, we already learned those hotkeys, right? So you're not going to really use those anymore unless you just can't remember the hotkey, in which case you can always just select it on this left row. By hovering your mouse over a button, it will most of the time show you the hotkey for that particular selection as well. So hover on move and it shows you that you can do it with G. And for the rest as well, so rotate, scale, transform. Now those bottom 3 ones I never really use. Well, the annotate, because Mr. Baked already did it at the start. He asked me how to remove. If you want to draw something, you can hold D, and it goes a little bit wild on the left, but I'm just holding it. I'm not actually pressing it 80 times. So hold it and then just press left mouse or hold left mouse, and it will draw a little annotation, right? So I can draw whatever I want. If you want to remove that, you hold D, I'm still holding, and then hold right mouse. And then you can just hover over it. It becomes an eraser. There we go. Now, that is the most important things from the bottom left. You also have this little measure tool, which I don't really use that often. You can use it, left click, and then you can just left click on, for example, this left ear of the monkey. Hold your mouse and move to the right ear, and you can get an estimation of the size of your monkey head. So 2.6 meters is quite a big monkey head. I want to remove this, so I'm just going to press Ctrl Z. There we go. All right, so now this drawing is back. Remember the redo key, Ctrl Shift Z. There we go. Okay, now this bottom one is basically add a cube. We are not going to use that because the way I add cubes is by pressing Shift A, so the add menu, and then mesh, and then cube. And then I just scale, rotate that cube with the hotkeys that we already learned. Okay, so those are pretty much the icons in the left that we're going to use. Now we've had this part. I can actually draw what we already had. If I go to the draw tool, the annotate. So this is what we have explained. Also, this top left part is what we already went into a little bit of detail about, except for the object. So the object is, well, it contains all of the settings for your object. So all of the things you can do with your object. And this will be executed on the object that you will have selected at that point. So if I go back to the select tool, which will be, remember, W, and I select my monkey, left click. Now, if I go to object, everything that I do here will be related to this monkey head. All right, so what we can do, for example, is, let's see, what is something fun we can do? Don't worry about all of those options. We're going to learn all of it at some point in those tutorials. So you can transform and move. Well, let's just do that for now. So left click on that move, and then it will basically be the same as grabbing your monkey with G, right? So escape if you want to cancel the movement. Escape. You've got some other options. Nothing that I really have to explain right now. So don't worry about all of those options. We'll get into it. Right, so that is pretty much the part up there done as well. Now, we've got a few buttons in the top here. And you don't have this row probably because you haven't installed the Blender Kit add-on right now. So don't worry if you don't see this part right there. It will be there once you install that Blender Kit add-on. So we're going to focus on those little icons right there. And that will change the way you move around in your viewport a little bit. So we've got the transformation orientation. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means that the movements you do with your head, they are being done on the global scale. So the global scale is defined by the axis that you see. So you see the direction of the red line, that's the global x-axis. You see the direction of the green line, that's the direction of the global y-axis. So those are all the global axes in Blender, and those will not change whatever you do with the object. That's what global stands for. They will remain the same with whatever you do. So they will remain global and they will remain just like this. Okay, but you can also set this to local, for example. And if you set this to local, then the transformation orientation will change based on your object. So if I set this to local, then the transformation will change to the axis of your object. Well, right now it is the same as the global orientation because we haven't really made any changes, right? So remember, on the top right, we've got this information. So this item panel that shows us the transformations. It is set to 0. The location changed a little bit, but the rotation is still 0. So if I press G and Y now, that y-axis will basically be related to your object axis, so to the local axis, right? So remember, global will be your scene dependent, so Blender dependent, they will remain the same, and local will change with your object. All right. So next up, we've also got normal. And the normal option is something that requires a little bit more of an explanation. So if I set this to normal, what basically happens is that your object will move according to the normal direction of a face. And that is something that may sound weird, or you may not know what that means right now, which is fine. I can explain you a little bit about what normals are. So if I zoom into this monkey, you will see that it is made out of different faces, right? So each of those faces, and they are connected with 4 points right now. So you can see those 4 corners, the stuff in between is a face, right? And each face has a normal direction, which is basically the direction of that face. So a line that you can set on that face that is perpendicular to this plane. So let me actually draw that. So for example, if we have the side view of a plane, which is flat, right? Oh, beautiful plane, very straight. So if this is our face, so if this is this face, for example, this monkey face, then the normal direction will either be perpendicular in this direction, I think you draw something like that, or it will be the other way around. But it will also always be perpendicular to a face. And that's what unnormal basically means. So perpendicular to a face. So you can imagine that once you go and edit your geometry and you want to move a specific face, and you have this set on a normal, then that face will move in the normal direction. So for example, if we would go and edit this face specifically, and we have this set to normal, then that face will move into those directions. So the perpendicular directions of that face. All right, well, that makes sense, I hope. If not, don't worry. I'm going to touch upon that once we go into actual editing of our objects. Okay, now I'm just going to leave this little line right there for the funs. And then we've got the section to the right. And I know there are more options right here, but we're not going to use those right now. The top 3 are the most important ones. Okay, options to the right. It is your pivot point. And I already explained to you what the origin of the object does, right? So you see the little orange point right there in the middle of your Suzanne, so the monkey head, right there, is the origin of your object. And by default, that means that your object rotates, so press R, it rotates around that point, right? And you can change that. So if you want your object to rotate around something else, for example, you can change that right there in that transform pivot point section. So if you left click on it, you get some different options. And I'm not going to explain all of them right now, but the ones I use the most is median point, which basically means the origin of your selected objects. And individual origins means that multiple objects will rotate around their own origins, right? So for example, if I duplicate the Suzanne, you don't have to follow me on this, it's just as an explanation. So if I press Shift D is for duplicating an object if you have it selected. Shift D, well, you can follow me, I'm explaining it already at this point. So Shift D, and then you can just move it to a new place. And I can do this as often as I want. So left click to apply that duplication, and then press Shift D once again. And it moves to wherever you want. And you will get a copy, a duplication of that selected object. Now, if you go back to your select tool, W, and you select each of those Suzannes, you can see that the orange point is located at the origin of your Suzanne, right? So this one of the right Suzanne is right there in the middle one will be right there, and the left one is right there. So the origins are different, which basically means that if I select all of those objects, and you can select multiple things by holding Shift. So holding Shift means that you can add things to your selection. So if I hold Shift right now and left click on this middle Suzanne, it will add this to the selection. Do it on the third as well. So hold Shift, left click. It will select all of your things, all of your Suzannes. So now we've got this pivot point set on median point, which means it will basically pick the center point of those objects. So if I select R now, so R to rotate, and if I press Z to lock it into the Z axis, you will see that those points, or sorry, those Suzannes will now rotate around the same point. So in this case, that is the middle Suzanne. All right, left click to cancel this rotation. Or sorry, left click to apply the rotation, escape to cancel the rotation. There we go. Now, if I set this, left click on that transform pivot point button, left click. And if we set this to the individual origins, and you can hover over it and it will say pivot around each object's own origin. Left click. If I do the same now, RZ, you can see that each Suzanne will now rotate around their own little origin. Right? So that is something that will be very useful depending on the kind of rotation that you want to do with your objects. All right, so that is what the pivot point basically means of an object. It defines where your rotations, your locations, your transformations are based upon. So for example, if I left click and press G and Y, well, obviously they're all going to move in the same direction now, but they're basically going to move as individual objects. So we've got other options as well. I usually do medium points or individual origins, but from time to time, I do use the 3D cursor as a pivot point, right? So the 3D cursor, if you select that one, it means that it's going to rotate around your 3D cursor. So if we set that to a different position, so I'm going to left click on that 3D cursor in the left row right there. And then I'm just going to place it away from my objects. For example, right there. And if I press the R key to rotate right now, you will see with a little dotted line that it is connected to your 3D cursor. So if I rotate this now, it will rotate it around your 3D cursor. All right, so you may not be able to see how this can help you out, but trust me, it will help us out at some point in the future. So the 3D cursor in Blender, very important, can be used for multiple things, so also for actually being an origin point of your movements, your transformations. All right, press W to go back to your selection tool. And now we've got some more options. Right, so I'm just going to move through the list of these top icons. The one to the right is snap. And snap, well, it does exactly what you think it does. It snaps while you move, rotate your objects. Left click it to enable, so it will highlight in blue. And now if I select only this right Suzanne, and I press G to move, it will try to snap to points in your scene. And that's what it is set on by default. It is set to snap to your grid, so to the increments. And you can see that it snaps to the points of your grid. So you can see those little dark gray or light gray lines right at the bottom of your screen. Well, the bottom, it is basically this this floor plane in your screen, right? So the little gray grid that you can see, those have increments. So each cross section, so each point where those lines are coming together is pretty much an increment. So if I press G and move this around, it will snap to those increments. So that's the default setting. You can change that by going to the right of that snap icon and left click. And now we can change what it snaps to. So by default, it's set on increment, which is what I just explained. But you can also select, for example, vertex, edge, face, volume. Well, you can select a lot of things. To know what those are, we are going to have to go into edit mode, which is what we will do. I think that's going to come into play in the next tutorial. But for example, let me just show you what it is. I'm going to select face project for now. So left click on that. And now just move your mouse away. Now if I press G again, and I move this, for example, towards the other Suzanne, you can see that it doesn't really do anything until your mouse hovers over the object. So right there. So now it will try to snap the object to the other Suzanne, right? And it may not make a lot of sense right now, but we will get into that a little bit later. It is going to be very nice when we get into edit mode. So once we're going to edit those meshes, that's when we're going to use that snapping mode the most. So I will explain it once again when we get there. All right, now the next things, this is proportional editing and the fall off. So proportional editing, it is an amazing feature in Blender. I use it all the time. Not that much in object mode. So right now, remember, we are in object mode, not in edit mode. In object mode, if you enable proportional editing, so press that little circle icon right there, left click, and it will be blue highlighted when enabled. And before we forget, let's disable that snapping icon. So let's left click on this little magnet. And then we can try out the proportional editing tool. So if I select one of my Suzannes, so I've got the right one selected. So if I press G, you will now see a circle appear right at your 3D cursor. And that is basically what your what your proportional editing tool does. Left click for now, so apply that. we are going to set our pivot point back to the medium point. So remember, this icon right there defines where your pivot point is. I want this to be back at my origin. So left click and go back to medium point. There we go. So now if I press G, you will see that circle appear around your Suzanne, so around the origin. And that basically means that your proportional editing tool is enabled. So whenever you see this circle, you have proportional editing tool enabled. And that is something that can be quite tricky. If you have it enabled and you don't really know what it does, then it can be very irritating. Because if I scale this up so you can see the circle, if you now move your scroll wheel, so scroll up or down, you can see the size of that circle changes, right? And what that circle indicates is what will move together with the selected object. So if I scroll up all the way, so move your circle bigger, you can see that Suzanne on the left will now also move with the selected object. So you can see that the second Suzanne falls just within that circle of our proportional editing tool. So it will not move as much as the first Suzanne because it has a little fall off. So the closer it is to the edge of that circle, the less it will move with the object, but it will move together with the selected object. So if I now make the circle even bigger by scrolling, you can see that now the third Suzanne will also move. So if you ever come at a point where if you move an object, random other objects start moving with it as well, then there's a high chance that you have proportional editing tool enabled, right? So you can see that if your circle is that big, you will not see the circle. So sometimes it can be very weird when you have it enabled, but your circle is so big that you can't see it. Then you may wonder, why is everything moving together with the object that I have selected? Well, it is proportional editing tool. So left click to apply that movement. So that is this little circle right there. It is the proportional editing object. The thing to the right of that will define the fall off. So it's set on smooth. So what I said is the closer it comes to that circle, the less it will move with the selected object, right? So right now we have a smooth fall off. So the closer it gets to the edge, the smoother it will fall off. So the transformation strength will decrease very smoothly the closer it gets to that edge of the circle. And you can also set this to sphere, for example. And we will get into this in editing mode as well. It's very fun to use. So we are definitely going to use that in edit mode in the next tutorial. Okay, so you can forget about the rest for now. And make sure to disable that by left clicking. There we go. All right, so we've got those icons set. And let me actually see the time where we at. Oh, we're already.
Yeah, I was about to say we can probably wrap it up in the next 5 minutes or so if you want to.
Yeah, I had no idea that we are already that far.
You've been killing it, sir. You just been doing what you love, and here we are an hour later.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's clear what I'm doing. You can always just rewatch it later if things are going a little bit too fast. As you can see, there is just a lot to get into, so we haven't even finished most of the interface yet. But those are the most important tools to use. So the rest we can go and get into while we actually model something as well. But yeah, let's wrap it up right now. I think this is a good point. We've discussed the interface, we've discussed the 3D viewport, and we've got the main tool set on the left discussed as well, and the way to actually change the transformation points. So I think that's a good way to start off the first tutorial. So there is just a lot to get into those tutorials, but don't worry, we will get into actually modeling and editing and animating soon enough. It is just very important to get those fundamentals in your system and the hotkeys as well, just so that once you get into modeling, you know what is going on. So that is Well, I think that's it for this tutorial actually. So I hope it was clear enough to follow. If not, please just give me feedback and I will change that in the next tutorial. The next tutorial, as I said, we're going to get a little bit more into editing. So the editing of objects, just so we can start modeling a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Nino. At least for me, listening along, it was super clear. There's definitely a few things that I'll have to go back and look at just because personally I can't memorize everything the first time around. But I think it'll be a good it's a good pace to go back and look at and listen again. It's not like you were, at least in my opinion, I don't think you were going too fast or anything like that. If anyone did, please speak up and we can work on that. But from my perspective, it was really easy to follow along.
All right, glad to hear that for sure. Yeah, like I said, don't get worried with this interface. So you can see there is still an entire section on the bottom right that we haven't touched yet, which is what we're going to get into when we are going to edit our objects. So when we're actually going to model, when we're going to render stuff, that's when we're going to have a chat about that little section. For the next class, I think it will be fun to have some modeling included. So that's when we're going to go into edit mode. So you can all create some of your own stuff already. That will be very possible with what we've just learned and with some more information about the things in the edit mode. So remember, tab will bring you from object to edit mode. So that is what we're going to get into next time, editing.
Let's go. Thank you, Nino. I appreciate you. I don't personally have any questions, but if anyone does, please feel free. Also, we have the Blender tips, helps, and discussion channel for you guys, where if you're going back and listening to this again and trying it out for yourself, and there's something you don't quite understand or you have a question, just send it in there. And whenever Nino's available, he'll answer it for you. We also have a few other members like the Bull Vader who have some experience in Blender as well. So if they're able to answer, then they will help as well. And that's kind of the end goal with this, right? As you guys learn more and as we get new members coming into Puppets, the basics you guys can then go ahead and help them with if they have questions, because you'll have that knowledge at some point. And I'm really excited to see us all get to that point where we're all helping each other out and learning and growing from each other within this. So thank you, Nino. You're the root of a lot of growth that's about to happen.
Yeah, I love it. I can't wait to get to the part where we can all start modeling whatever we have in our minds. It just takes a little bit of time to get settled in Blender, to start it up and to get the fundamentals right. And then I promise we'll get into animating, modeling, sculpting, the fun parts as soon as possible. All right.
Awesome.
Does anyone have any questions, Mr. Baked? How was it?
He's still picking his jaw up off the ground.
No, I I just need to look which mouse I use. As I said, I have like the video screen on my big monitor and Blender actually on the laptop, but it was clearly understandable. I'm quite fascinated that it was not that complicated, or I was scared that it would be more complicated, but it was clearly understandable. I need to rewatch a few things, but yeah, I don't have the trouble or the struggle that I have when I worked the first time with Blender, as I know how to rotate, I know to move through my scene. So yeah, pretty comfy.
Nice. Glad to hear that.
Yeah, we also have a question from Bull Vader in the chat. His mic's not working. But he's asking for if you could show a scene or some type of sneak peek of something you've been working on.
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's see. What do you want to see? I got so much.
Everything.
Everything. Yeah, let's see.
I'm curious how you made the B&B logo actually for the Megaspace thing.
Oh,
Like how's that put together on the back end?
let me find it. I was just
It was on
there.
that. Yeah, it was on the first page. That's what made me think about it.
Let me see if I can find it. Ah, there
There
it
it
is.
is.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
So
I just want to know how you got that like holographic look within Blender.
let me open it real quick.
Let's
Right.
go.
So you mean this logo in the middle?
Yeah.
Well, it did boggle my mind a little bit to get this. Turning 2D things into 3D is always a little bit weird, right? But you can see in render mode, and I hope this won't work my mic too hard, because I'm using a GPU program that clears my mic a little bit. So if I go into render mode and I stutter, please tell me.
Okay.
All right, I think we should be quite all right.
Yeah, it's slightly different, but I can still understand you.
Okay, so yeah, this is well, you can see the difference, right? Right, this is all completely solid, and the fun stuff that makes it look like a hologram is all done in shaders and textures. So there's another fun part in Blender that we're going to get into. Well, it won't be, of course, the next tutorial, because we still have to set up how to actually make the shapes and stuff. But yeah, this is all the fun part in Blender. You can see that I set up my scenes exactly around what I want to see through the camera, right? So right now it looks like there's nothing there, or at least not much. But when I go to camera view, you can see that everything that I want to show is there, which is just a part of modeling efficiently. So if you know what a piece is going to be used for, and you know what it's going to look like, you can just pretty much model whatever is going to be visible in your scene and leave out the rest. So this is one of the examples. I did create those characters myself. I rigged them all myself as well. So if I press Alt H, you can see all of the bone structures, and I can move those characters around just like this.
Oh, he doesn't have feet.
No, he has just little stumps.
No, there's no reason for you to have feet in there.
No, you don't really see them.
How long does something like this take you start to finish?
I think this one took me around 2 hours.
Holy shit. That's mind blowing.
That's fast.
Yeah, at some point you'll be able to create stuff like this in a nutshell, right? So these characters, they are quite easy. Those little bones that you see, they are set up quite fast. I mean, I love putting bones on stuff. So recently I also created this. I can just show it. I won't show it rendered. So this Kitaro that we are making with the team. There's no reason for me to actually make it animatable. But it's...
Oh my god, that ended up so good.
Yeah, right? So there is a lot of hair, once again, which fucks up my computer a little bit. But when I turn that off, and I go and press Alt H, you can see that this is having the same kind of bone structure. So I can actually move my model, make it dance a little bit. So I can do whatever I want with it, even though it is going to end up as like a still image. The same thing for the character on the left. This is a character that I reuse from time to time, just because I put a lot of time into modeling the cloth and stuff, so I might as well reuse it, right? I rigged that one as well, so you can see this one is movable too. I can make them both dance a little bit.
Oh my god.
So yeah, I won't show the end result of this one yet, but it's turned out very, very nicely.
We're gonna make so much cool stuff together.
Oh yeah, 100%. 100%. And this rain that you can see right here, is made in Geometry Nodes. Geometry Nodes is an entire subset in Blender. It is very new, but that is going to be, I guess, somewhere at the well, once we get the modeling, the texturing, and everything set up, then we'll get into Geometry Nodes. But that's going to be quite.
Yeah, that'll be quite. I would say quite some time until we get to that point. I feel like.
Yeah. So let me go to my folder and see if there's anything you want to see.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get in that when I get to that point. I'll just get in the habit of adding bones to everything as well, because that makes it probably easier once we try to do all the like metaverse type stuff down the road.
Yeah, it's completely reusable. So for example, this dragon, I think I rigged that as well, so I can also animate the dragon, for example. Let me actually see. I can't
So
remember.
you probably have my liquid head in there somewhere too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let me see if I also animated this dragon. So yeah, the thing I learned with the, for example, rigging is, it's called when you actually add a bone structure to your objects, which means you can move them around and stuff like that, and animate different limbs and legs. I think this one has one. Oh shit.
Oh my.
Let me see. This one, yeah. So I added the entire bone structure for this dragon, wings included and everything. Just so I can change the pose of my dragon, right? So I can change how far the jaw opens and closes. I can change where this wing. Let me see. So I can change the position of the wings, how much it flaps and flies. I can change the entire direction of the head, if it moves up or down. So you can see that a lot of the stuff, when you rig it, it becomes so much easier to create poses, and it just becomes so much nicer to reuse models for different scenes and stuff like that. So yeah, that is something that we are also going to learn, is how to do things like this, how to move, how to rig bigger objects so you can move them around freely, move the tail. Yeah, I'm just getting carried away here again. Yeah.
making the dragon play what's that game when you Twister?
Yeah, I just broke his neck, I think.
Oh, that's wild. Thank you for showing us.
No problem. Yeah, things like this is what we're going to be aiming for.
Yes, sir.
All right. So if there are any more questions or stuff you want to see, just let me know. Otherwise, we can probably wrap this up.
Yeah, I think I'm good. I think, yeah, we've been doing this over an hour now, and I know we want to keep the classes to about an hour so we don't overdo it with information and keep it in manageable segments. So we're good for today for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, just gonna show you one last thing, because I know some people have lower graphic cards. So I'm just gonna show you a scene that I made with a 960. So NVIDIA GTX 960, so you know what is still going to be capable with a lower graphics card. So for example, this one. So you can see that you can get quite detailed with even a lower quality of graphics cards without that actually messing up your computer. It will mean that it's going to render out a little bit slower, but you can see that there are still going to be some details possible and stuff like that. So there's no reason to worry about having or working on a laptop, for example, or having a lower end graphics cards or a CPU. All right, with that, let's wrap this up.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to have some food, and then I'll probably move to the coffee shop after at some point.
Yeah, I think I'll do the same. Make some toast, make some more coffee, and then hop in the coffee shop for whoever wants to hang out in there. But I just got to say again to everyone in here, thank you for coming to the very first Blender class. you guys were part of history today because it's the first one, you know. So thank you for being here. Definitely, you know, spread the word on Twitter. Tell your friends that this is what we're doing and we're serious about it. So if anyone's interested in joining the artist army that we're trying to build up here at Baked Universe, let's fucking go. Thank you guys, and thank you again, Nino, for sharing your time and going through that with us, because I know you have a lot of knowledge, and you don't have to share it with us, but you believe the same thing we believe, and us all doing this together. So I can only put the flowers out there and appreciation for you as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. It's very fun. It's the first live class that I've done, so that's only up from here. So thank you all for for being there. And next time, I think it will be next week. I think once a week. We will get a little bit more into editing and how you can actually create some shapes that you want. That's gonna be fun.
Let's go. Awesome. Well, I'll see everyone in the coffee shop in a few minutes.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nino.
Peace.